They told me family meant loyalty. But what would you feel if yours handed you a red envelope on Christmas morning asking you to sign away your life? I smiled. I signed, and I walked out. What they didn't know was that the ink would fade, and their empire with it. The next day the news broke, their accounts froze, and my phone burned with 99 missed calls. I'm Lauren Pierce, and this is how I gave my family the gift of truth, wrapped in silence. The road into Maple Falls was buried under a soft blanket of snow, the kind that glowed faintly under the headlights and made everything look like a postcard. I'd been driving for nearly 4 hours from Denver, coffee long gone cold, in the cup holder, the radio playing a Christmas song that used to make me smile. Now it only filled the silence I didn't know what to do with. By the time I turned onto Cedar Lane, my stomach was tight with a feeling I couldn't name. Every house was glowing. Porches draped in lights, wreaths, perfectly hung silhouettes of families moving behind frosted windows. I slowed as I passed the church. Its bell rang in the distance, slow and familiar. It should have felt like coming home. Instead, it felt like approaching a stage after everyone had already taken their seats. When I pulled into the driveway, the old Pierce house looked the same as it always had. 2 stories, white trim smoke curling from the chimney, warm yellow light spilling from the windows. A giant pine tree blinked in gold and silver through the front window. My chest tightened with something between nostalgia and dread. Home, I whispered to no one, forcing a smile. I'm home. The door opened with the same creak it always had. For a second, I expected to hear footsteps. Laughter, my mom calling from the kitchen. But the house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses on your ribs, warning you that something isn't right. The scent of cinnamon and gingerbread hung in the air, familiar but distant. The fire in the living room crackled softly. My father sat on the sofa, half turned toward me, a whiskey glass in his hand. He didn't get up. His eyes flicked to me and then away like I was someone he hadn't expected to see. "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual, trying to sound like we were still normal. He set the glass down, cleared his throat. "Lauren." His voice was lower than I remembered. "We need to talk." My mother sat on the opposite side of the couch, posture, perfect makeup, flawless, even at 6 in the evening. She smiled, but it wasn't warmth. It was performance. "Your father's right," she said lightly. "We have things to discuss, but first you must be tired from the drive." Before I could respond, a soft clinking of glass made me turn. Jenna descended the staircase slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding a wine glass. Her hair fell in glossy curls over a white sweater that looked too expensive for comfort. She smiled the way people do when they know the camera's on them. "Lauren," she said, dragging out my name like a word she hadn't used in a while. "You made it. I said I would." I smiled back thinly. "Merry Christmas." She raised her glass. "Merry Christmas." I set my suitcase down by the door. "Where's everyone else?" "Thought we'd be having dinner by now." My mom exchanged a glance with my dad. Then she gave a soft, dismissive laugh. "Oh, the plans changed a bit. We're keeping things smaller this year. More focused. Focused." The word hit wrong. I looked at my father again. He hadn't moved. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed somewhere on the carpet. "What's going on?" I asked finally. He hesitated, then said quietly, "It's time to talk about the future of this family." My mom leaned back, crossed one leg over the other. "You've built your own life in Denver," she said. "You've done well for yourself. Jenna's here, she's been helping us with the business. She understands what this family needs." I blinked. "What this family needs?" "Yes," she said. "It's time to pass the torch, so to speak." Her tone was sweet, but sharp. "Your time is over, Lauren. Jenna's the one who'll help us move forward now." For a second, I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd, like I'd stepped into the wrong house. My time is over. What was this, a coronation? Jenna stood beside the fireplace, now swirling her wine, pretending not to look at me, but clearly enjoying every second. I laughed once, short and hollow. "You're joking." My father's voice dropped, rehearsed and final. "We're not. You've been gone a long time. Things have changed." The room seemed to tilt. The fire cracked louder, the lights shimmered in the corner of my eye. I could feel the heat from the hearth on my skin, but it didn't warm me. "Changed," I said softly. "I came home." "That's supposed to mean something." "It does," my mother said, standing. "It means closure." Something inside me sank. I looked at them, the parents who raised me, the sister who used to steal my sweaters. and felt like I was staring at strangers dressed in my family's faces. Voiceover. In that moment, I realized they had already said goodbye long before I walked through the door. I forced a smile, small and sharp. Right. Closure. I picked up my suitcase and started for the stairs. My father didn't stop me. My mother said something about resting before dinner, but her voice was just noise. As I reached the landing, I paused. The fireplace flickered below, casting long shadows up the wall. My eyes drifted to the mantel. 3 stockings hung neatly in a row. 1 for Charles, 1 for Evelyn, 1 for Jenna. Mine was gone. The one I'd embroidered when I was 10, the one that had hung there every year since missing. In its place, right in the center, was a new stocking with shiny gold letters. Jenna Pierce. The sight hit harder than it should have. I felt something twist inside my chest, something small and mean and breaking all at once. The lights from the Christmas tree shimmered against the window, reflecting in my eyes. They looked like tears, but they weren't. Not yet. I turned, climbed the last few steps, and shut my bedroom door behind me. Dinner smelled the same as every year. Roast beef, rosemary red wine. But it didn't taste like home anymore. The dining room was picture perfect, the kind of scene you'd see on a Christmas card: red tablecloth, crystal glasses, candles flickering over polished silverware. My mother had gone all out, as if presentation could fix whatever was broken underneath. I took my usual seat next to her. Across from me sat my father, shoulders squared, like he was presiding over a board meeting instead of Christmas dinner. Between them, right at the head of the table where I used to sit, was Jenna. She looked flawless. Her hair shone under the candlelight, her nails gleamed red, her smile camera-ready. I watched her tilt her wineglass toward the light like she was testing its reflection. Mom started talking before anyone could take a bite. "Well, this year's been quite something," she said brightly. "Pierce Home and Tools is expanding. 2 new branches by spring. And, of course, Jenna's stepping in to oversee operations. Everyone in town is talking about it." I looked up the fork, frozen halfway to my mouth. Jenna. My father didn't even glance at me. She's been very involved lately, has a real instinct for leadership. It's good for the family, Lauren. You've got your own career now. You should focus on that. My throat tightened. So what exactly does that mean? I'm not part of the company anymore? He took a sip of wine, calm, deliberate. Don't twist this into something personal. It's just practical. You're in Denver. You've built your own life. The business needs someone who's here day to day. The room fell quiet except for the faint hum of a Christmas carol from the next room. I looked between them, waiting for someone to soften the blow, to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, Jenna let out a soft laugh. "I've been saying for years that the family needs someone who puts it first," she said, spearing a piece of roast beef. "Someone who shows up." I met her eyes across the table. "I've shown up," I said. "Every time you called, every time they needed help. I flew back for Dad's surgery. Mom's birthday, Thanksgiving." She cut me off smoothly. "Sure, but when you leave again, it's like you were never here. It's hard to build a future that way." I turned to my mother. "Mom." She smiled without meeting my gaze, scooping potatoes onto her plate. "Don't start an argument at dinner, dear. It's Christmas." Something inside me went cold. I set my fork down carefully. "Then I'll spare you the argument," I said quietly. "Excuse me." I pushed my chair back, its legs scraping against the floor louder than I meant. My father didn't say a word. Neither did my mother. Jenna smirked faintly, the kind of smirk people wear when they know they've won. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside. The air was sharp, slicing through me. Snow drifted down in slow spirals, covering my footprints almost as soon as I made them. The house behind me glowed warm through the windows. Laughter echoing faintly from inside as another song started playing. For a moment, I stood there staring up at the sky, breath clouding in front of me. I thought about every version of Christmas I'd ever had, when we'd bake cookies together, when Dad would play piano badly, when Mom would hum along, and how each of those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. I walked to the edge of the porch, leaned on the railing, and let the cold sting my fingers. The quiet was almost peaceful. I used to think distance was what changed people, that leaving town, chasing your own life, created the gap. But standing there, I realized silence can do the same thing. You can sit across from someone you love and still be miles apart. Snow gathered on my shoulders and my hair. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a work email. I didn't check it. I didn't move. I just breathed and let the frost bite at the edges of my patience. When I finally went back inside, the house felt even emptier. The dining table had been cleared. From the hallway, I could hear my parents laughing softly in the living room. A sound that should have been comforting, but now sounded rehearsed. I climbed the stairs slowly. My room was at the end of the hall, same door, same squeaky hinge. But when I turned the knob and stepped in, it wasn't mine anymore. The walls were a pale beige instead of the soft blue I'd painted before leaving for college. My old oak furniture was gone, replaced with sleek white pieces that looked like they belonged in Jenna's Instagram feed. The shelves where my sketchbooks used to sit were empty. On the dresser stood a single photo frame my parents and Jenna at some town charity gala smiling for the camera. I wasn't in it. I walked to the closet. Empty. Not a trace of me left. The air smelled faintly of new paint and perfume that wasn't mine. Then I saw it, a flash of red on the desk, a thick envelope centered perfectly against the polished surface. Confidential. Property transfer. It read in neat type across the front. For a long time I just stared at it, my reflection faint in the glossy finish. My fingers twitched toward it, but I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Whatever was inside, I already knew it wasn't meant for me. Something colder than the winter air crept through my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed. Someone else's bed now. And looked around one last time. Every trace of me had been painted over, replaced, erased. Downstairs, laughter rose again, Jenna's voice high and carefree. I pressed my hands together, breathing slowly, forcing my heartbeat to settle. The envelope caught the light again, that sharp gleam of red against the white. I reached for it. At last my hand steady. The paper was smooth, heavy, official. My name wasn't on it. I smiled bitterly. Of course it isn't. The clock downstairs chimed softly, marking the hour, and in that quiet, I realized the cold I felt had nothing to do with the snow outside. Snow pressed against the window in thick, soundless sheets, swallowing the world outside. I lay still on the bed that used to be mine, staring at the faint crack of light under the door. Every creak of the house sounded louder in the dark. Somewhere downstairs, the clock chimed once, soft and hollow. Then I heard it, voices. Low, muffled, not the steady hum of a TV, but the kind of whispering that people do when they're hiding something. I pushed back the blanket and slipped my feet into cold slippers. The hallway was dim, a stripe of gold from the nightlight stretching across the floor. I moved quietly, step by step, until I could see over the banister. Downstairs, the fire was still burning in the living room, the flames throwing a restless orange glow over the walls. My father sat on the couch, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. My mother was beside him, her hands clenched around a mug. Jenna stood near the fireplace, her face half lit by the flicker. Charles spoke first, his voice low and clipped. "Tomorrow morning she'll sign. Henry's already notarized the documents. Everything's ready." Evelyn's voice trembled. "Are you sure that's wise? What if she questions it?" Jenna shrugged, swirling what looked like another glass of wine. "She won't. She never does. Lauren hates confrontation more than anything. She'll want to keep the peace." The words landed like small, clean knives. I gripped the banister so tightly my knuckles ached. The sound of the fire snapping filled the pauses between them. My father exhaled. "This has to be done. The timing's right. Once it's official, there's no going back." Evelyn hesitated. "And if she refuses?" "She won't," he said, cutting her off. We raised her to be reasonable. A silence followed. An easy, practiced kind of silence that said they'd been planning this for months. I could see Jenna's face reflected in the firelight. She looked pleased, calm, like a child promised a gift she'd always wanted. That's when I knew. Whatever was in that red envelope, it wasn't just paperwork. It was my erasure, written, signed, sealed. I backed away from the stairs before anyone could notice me. My heart pounded against my ribs as I slipped back into my room and shut the door without a sound. For a long minute, I just stood there, my back against the door, listening to the faint hum of their voices beneath me. Then I walked to the desk, picked up the red envelope, and tore it open. The papers inside were thick, embossed with the Pierce Home and Tools logo. The first line caught my eye, transfer of ownership and property rights. My name appeared once, followed by a line that said, "Hereby relinquishes all claims to assets, holdings, and estates to beneficiary. Jenna Pierce. My breath caught. I flipped through page after page, the house, the company, the land. Everything signed over, everything gone. And then I saw it. The notary stamp in the corner dated yesterday. My signature was already there. I traced it with my fingertip. It looked like my handwriting. Almost, but not quite. A faint smear of pink lipstick marked the top corner of the page, the exact shade my mother had worn at dinner. For a moment, I couldn't move. The room spun slowly like I'd stood up too fast. It wasn't fear I felt, it was exposure, like standing under a harsh light every illusion burned away. They'd prepared this for a long time. The family meetings I wasn't invited to, the paperwork they said was too complicated, the sudden renovation of my room. It all fit now. They weren't planning to include me. They were preparing to replace me. I went to the window. Outside, the snow was falling harder, thick enough to blur the streetlights. Maple Falls looked peaceful like a postcard. Inside, the warmth of the room felt wrong, sticky. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass. My reflection stared back pale and distant. For years, I had been the reliable one. The one who came home when they needed help, who kept the family running when they couldn't. And now, I was an inconvenience to be signed away. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me. I reached for it out of instinct, half hoping it was someone who could pull me out of this nightmare. The screen lit up. Jason Miller. Last call, December 2021. The sight of his name stirred something in me. An echo of a time when I still believed in loyalty. He'd worked for my father for years, always honest, always steady. If anyone knew what was really going on, it would be him. I hovered over his name for a long moment. Then I put the phone down. Not tonight. Not yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope open beside me, papers spread across the blanket, like evidence at a crime scene. I thought about walking downstairs, throwing the documents into the fire, watching their faces burn with it. But then I imagined the look they'd give me. The same calm, patronizing one they'd used all night. The look that said, "You're overreacting, Lauren. You always do." No, I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it under my pillow. My fingers were shaking, but not from fear anymore. From clarity. They thought I'd sign whatever they put in front of me. They thought I'd smile and make it easy for them. If they believed that, then they'd never truly known me. Outside, the wind picked up, howling softly through the trees. The fire downstairs crackled louder. I lay back on the bed, eyes open, the red envelope inches from my head. My pulse matched the ticking of the clock on the wall. They were sleeping soundly downstairs, certain of their victory. But morning was coming, and I wasn't the daughter they remembered. Morning came with blinding sunlight bouncing off the snow, the kind that forces you to squint even before you open the door. The storm from the night before had stopped, leaving the whole town glittering under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. I pulled on my coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and stepped outside. The air was sharp enough to sting. Maple Falls was already awake. Neighbors shoveling driveways, kids dragging sleds, music floating faintly from Main Street, where the Christmas parade was being set up. For a moment, I let myself breathe it in. The sound, the smell of pine and smoke, the familiarity of it all. It almost worked. Almost made me forget what was waiting inside that red envelope, still hidden under my pillow. Then a voice called out from across the street. "Lauren, well, look who's home." I turned. Karen Dalton. Our next-door neighbor stood at the end of her driveway, bundled up in a coat the color of a candy cane. She waved a big, cheery smile on her face. "Hi, Karen," I said, forcing my own smile. She walked closer, snow crunching under her boots. "It's been ages, sweetheart. I just saw your mom the other day. She must be thrilled to have you home for the holidays." I nodded, unsure what to say. Karen's the kind of woman who always knows everything about everyone, and she's always dying to share it. Before I could reply, she said brightly, "And congratulations to Jenna. My husband said the whole town's talking about it. Her taking over the company. Such a big step for someone her age." My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry." "What did you say?" Karen's smile faltered. "Oh, I thought you knew. The store, Pierce Home and Tools. She's in charge now, right? Your mother mentioned." She caught herself, the color draining from her face. "Oh, maybe I've got it wrong. I just assumed." She trailed off, then quickly added, "Well, tell everyone Merry Christmas. and hurried back toward her porch. I stood there frozen, watching her disappear into the white glare of morning. My breath fogged the air in front of me, steady but tight. The town buzzed around me, unaware. Someone down the street was stringing lights on a lamppost. A child laughed. Somewhere bells chimed. It was all so normal it made my skin crawl. I turned back toward the house, boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the quiet pressed down again. My mother's favorite Christmas record was playing softly in the background. But no one was in the living room. I went straight upstairs to my room and shut the door. The envelope still lay where I'd left it. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Whatever doubts I had last night were gone now. This wasn't paranoia. It was happening. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at Jason Miller's name. Jason had worked for my father since I was in college. A good man, steady, no nonsense, the kind who kept things running even when Dad was too proud to admit he was in over his head. I hesitated only a second before hitting call. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and cautious. Lauren. Hey, Jason. Merry Christmas. A pause. Lauren. I was going to call you today. You're home. Yes. I swallowed hard. And apparently I've already been replaced. He let out a heavy sigh. You saw the papers. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I saw enough. He hesitated again, then said quietly, Don't sign anything, do you hear me? Whatever they tell you, don't sign. I wasn't planning to. I said, but I need to know what's going on. He exhaled sharply. It's bad. Charles, your dad, he's been moving money around for months. Big amounts. Loans, vendor payments that never reach the suppliers. The company's barely staying afloat. And now there's talk of other accounts. What kind of accounts? Ones that don't officially exist, he said. I found records of transfers to something called JP Consulting LLC. The room seemed to shrink around me. JP, I repeated slowly, as in Jenna Pierce. Yeah, he said. It's under her name, but the company doesn't have an address, no tax ID, nothing. It's a shell, Lauren, and the money going there isn't small change. It's 6 figures. I rubbed my temple, trying to think. You're sure about this? I wouldn't be calling you if I wasn't. His voice softened. There's more. Do you remember Owen Whitman? The name hit me like a jolt. Dad's old business partner, yeah. The one who pulled out of the expansion deal in 2016. He's been keeping tabs on your father ever since. Says he's got proof of fraud. He reached out to me last month, asked about you, me. He said if you ever came home, he wanted to talk to you. He thinks you might be the only one who can stop what's coming. What's coming, Jason? He hesitated, then said, Collapse. If your dad keeps doing what he's doing, Pierce Home and Tools won't survive the year. He's using Jenna to cover his tracks, but it's not going to work. The words made my stomach twist. I stared at the floor, the pattern in the carpet blurring as my mind spun. My father, my mother, my sister. They weren't just shutting me out. They were burying me with the wreckage of their lies. Lauren, Jason's voice broke through. Are you still there? Yeah, I said quietly. Where are you right now? At the cafe on Route 9 across from the old hardware store. I've got copies of the statements if you want to see them. I'll be there in 15. The drive took 10. The cafe was nearly empty, the air thick with the smell of espresso and cinnamon. Christmas songs played softly through cheap speakers. Jason sat in the back booth, a folder in front of him, his coat still dusted with snow. He looked older than I remembered, tired, wary. When he saw me, he managed a small smile. You look like your mom when you're angry, he said. I sat down. Let's skip that part. He nodded and opened the folder. Pages filled with numbers, bank stamps, transaction IDs. He slid one across the table. That's one of the transfers. $15,000 to JP Consulting LLC, 2 months ago. There are 6 more like it. I scanned the paper, my heart thudding. This can't be real. It's real. And that's not even the worst of it. He pulled out another page. Owen thinks your dad's funneling money through Jenna to liquidate the company before bankruptcy hits. He wants to meet you. I looked up. Owen Whitman wants to meet me. Jason nodded. He said he's been waiting for this for a long time. Outside, a car passed headlights cutting across the window. The reflection of the snow made everything look too bright, too exposed. I stared out at the road, my breath fogging the glass. Where is he, Boulder? Jason said. He's got some kind of workshop there. He doesn't trust phones, so if you're going, go in person. I turned back to him, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. And you? Why tell me all this? He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Because your father stopped listening a long time ago, and because someone in that family still deserves to know the truth. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind picked up again, scattering snow across the parking lot. I reached for the folder and closed it gently. Through the window, the sunlight reflected off the snowbank so hard it almost blinded me. For a second, it felt like the world was daring me to look away. I didn't. I stood, tucking the folder under my arm. Thank you, Jason. He nodded once. Be careful. I turned toward the door, the bell above it chiming, as I stepped out into the cold. The air smelled like frost and wood smoke like change. Boulder was 2 hours away, and whatever waited for me there, I wasn't turning back. The drive to Boulder took me through winding mountain roads that cut between tall pines and frozen cliffs. The sun was already dropping, streaking the snow in gold and pale orange. Every turn of the wheel felt heavier than it should have, like the road itself was testing my resolve. By the time I reached the edge of town, the air had turned silver with dusk. Boulder was quiet on Christmas afternoon, its shops closed, streets lined with glowing wreaths and fading footsteps. I followed Jason's directions through an industrial area until I spotted the address, an old woodworking shop tucked behind a row of storage units. A single light burned in the window. When I pushed the door open, the warmth hit me immediately. The smell of sawdust and cedar filled the air. Inside, a man was sanding the edge of a wooden frame, sleeves rolled up, his movements deliberate and slow. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, his jaw dusted with stubble. He looked up before I could speak. "Lauren Pierce," he said, setting the frame aside. His voice carried a calm certainty. "I knew you'd come." I hesitated in the doorway. "Jason told me you might know something." Owen Whitman wiped his hands on a rag, nodding. "I know more than something. Have a seat." He gestured toward a work table covered in papers, coffee cups, and tools. I walked over, cautiously brushing snow from my coat sleeve. "You knew my father." "Too well," he said dryly. "Charles Pierce owes me $500,000. A reputation that took me 10 years to rebuild." The words dropped like stones. "He never mentioned you. I'm sure he didn't. He doesn't mention people he's burned unless it's useful." He pulled out a chair across from me, then sat. When he tried to get me to sign on for another expansion deal last year, I started digging. Found more than I expected. He reached under the table and pulled out a small metal box, the kind used for storing expensive drill bits. Instead, when he opened it, there was a flash drive inside. He pushed it toward me. "What's on it?" I asked. Everything, he said. Bank transfers, forged notarizations, false statements. Things that connect Charles Pierce to a whole network of shady accounting. Enough to sink him legally and publicly. I didn't touch it right away. "Why give this to me?" "Because it's your name they used to make it all look clean," he said simply. "And because you still have something he doesn't. What's that?" Owen smiled faintly. "A conscience." The shop was quiet, except for the low hum of a space heater. I stared at the flash drive, my reflection faint on the metal. My hand trembled when I reached for it. He noticed. "You don't have to be afraid of this," he said gently. "Truth isn't a weapon. It's a mirror. Let him look at himself for once." I held the drive in my palm, cold and weightless. "I don't even know what to do with it." "You don't have to know yet." Owen leaned back. "But when the time comes, you'll know what to do." I looked at him. "You really think exposing him fixes anything?" "It doesn't fix him," he said. "It frees you. That's the only kind of justice that ever lasts." For a moment, we sat in silence. The light flickered across the wooden walls, the scent of pine filling the air. He reminded me of the kind of man my father used to pretend to be. Strong, steady, unshakably sure of right and wrong. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pen, placing it beside the flash drive. "You're going to sign something soon. You already know that, don't you?" I nodded slowly. "Use this pen," he said. "It's special ink. Disappears after 48 hours. They'll think you've signed away everything and they'll stop watching. That's when you make your move." I turned the pen in my hand. "You really thought this through." "I had years to think," he said, almost smiling. "I could have gone after him myself, but this is your story, not mine." I slipped both the pen and the flash drive into my coat pocket. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for trusting me with this." "I'm not trusting you," he said. I'm recognizing something. You've got the same look your father used to have when he was still trying to prove himself. The difference is, you're not lying about who you are. His words caught me off guard. And what am I? He studied me for a moment, then said, someone who's about to stop letting everyone else write her story. The heater clicked off, leaving the air heavy and still. Outside snow began to fall again, soft against the windows. I stood adjusting my scarf. You said he owes you $500,000. Why help his daughter? Owen gave a quiet laugh. Because revenge is overrated, but truth's a currency worth spending. I didn't know what to say. He walked me to the door, the wooden floor creaking beneath our steps. Lauren, he said as I reached for the handle. I turned. Don't go looking for blood, he said. Just make sure he can't hide anymore. I nodded, heart pounding. I'm not looking for blood. Good, he said, then smiled faintly. Then this will be the cleanest Christmas either of us has had in a long time. The door opened to the sharp bite of evening air. The sky over Boulder had deepened to indigo, the snow glowing faintly under the last scraps of daylight. I stood on the steps for a moment, the flash drive heavy in my pocket. Behind me, Owen called out one last thing, his voice echoing softly through the cold. You know Christmas is the best time to give real gifts. I looked back at him. You mean truth? He nodded once. Exactly that. The drive back down the mountain was darker, slower. The road curved through the pines, each turn lit by my headlights and the faint glimmer of ice. My reflection in the windshield looked older, sharper, like someone I was just beginning to recognize. They thought I'd come home to sign their papers and disappear quietly. But what I was bringing back to Maple Falls wasn't submission. It was the truth, and that was a gift they'd never see coming. Christmas morning smelled like cinnamon and polish. The kind of scent my mother loved, the one she used to say made the house feel like success. The table was set as if we were expecting guests. Red napkins folded into perfect triangles, china plates we hadn't used in years, candles flickering in neat symmetry. On the end, closest to my father, sat a stack of documents bound with a red ribbon. It looked less like Christmas morning, and more like a board meeting dressed up in tinsel. Charles cleared his throat, his voice deliberate and heavy. Let's get this done first, he said. The sooner we make it official, the sooner we can relax. Jenna was already sitting upright, perfectly poised, the kind of posture that photographs well. My mother was radiant in her favorite emerald sweater, a strand of pearls catching the candlelight. Her eyes flicked to me like she was checking for signs of resistance. I took my seat across from my father, folding my hands on the table. You're serious about doing this today, I said, my tone flat. Business doesn't stop for holidays, Charles replied, his mouth tightening. And this is business. Mom leaned forward, her voice honeyed. Sign, sweetheart, she said softly. Let's start the new year with peace. The word peace almost made me laugh. I looked down at the papers, pretending to study them. The first page bore the same heading I'd seen before: transfer of ownership and property rights. My name printed neatly in the top corner. Under it, Jenna's name. I ran my finger along the edge, careful not to betray anything. I just want a copy, I said calmly, to read over later. My father frowned. It's unnecessary. Everything's already been explained. Jenna smiled, overly confident. It's fine, Dad. Let her have it. She's just being thorough. She turned to me, her tone syrupy. Of course it won't change anything, but if it makes you feel better. I met her gaze, held it, and nodded. It does. My father slid the pen toward me. The one I'd brought, the one Owen had given me, lay in my palm before he could see me switch it. My fingers trembled, but not from fear. I lowered the tip to the line, my breath shallow. The ink flowed dark at first, then lighter, fading already as it touched the paper. The faintest trace of my signature curved at the bottom of the page. There, I said, forcing my voice steady. It's done. Charles exhaled the sound, almost relieved. Good. That's my girl. My mother's eyes softened with triumph. She reached across and squeezed my hand. See? That wasn't so hard. Jenna clapped her hands lightly. Now we can all move forward. Finally, I smiled. Finally. Inside, something sharp and electric pulsed through me. They didn't see it. The way my shoulders relaxed, not from defeat, but from control. They thought they'd won. I looked around the table at the three people who once made up my whole world, and realized how small that world had always been. I have something for you, I said suddenly. My mother perked up. Oh, a gift. I stood, smoothing my skirt. Something special. I crossed the room, careful not to hurry. Every eye followed me as I walked to the Christmas tree. The lights blinked in steady rhythm, red and gold and white. Beneath it, among the glossy boxes, I placed a small, silver-wrapped gift bag tied with a pale ribbon. Jenna tilted her head, curious. For who? For all of you, I said quietly. Mom smiled, delighted. Lauren, that's sweet. What is it? I met her eyes. Something you'll need tomorrow. Her smile faltered. What does that mean? You'll see, I said lightly. It's Christmas. Let's not ruin the mood. My father chuckled uneasily, interpreting it as guilt. She's sentimental, that's all. Jenna reached for the bag, but I stopped her with a look. Not yet, I said. It's meant to be opened in the morning. I turned back toward them. Merry Christmas. My mother's expression softened again. Merry Christmas, darling. The air in the room was too warm, too heavy with perfume and pride. I needed to leave before I said something I couldn't take back. I reached for my coat by the door. My father frowned. Where are you going? For a walk, I said. The air's better outside. Don't be long, he said. We still have dinner tonight. I won't. I lied. When I stepped out, the cold hit me like a slap, sharp and clean, cutting through the fog inside my chest. I drew in a deep breath, the kind that hurt, going down. Behind me, through the frosted windows, I could see them laughing again, probably toasting their cleverness, their control, their new beginning. They didn't notice the faint smudge of fading ink drying on the line I'd just signed. They didn't notice the small gift under the tree silver paper catching the glow of the firelight. I walked down the driveway, boots crunching against the snow, my breath a pale mist in the air. The world outside was silent except for the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees. It carried the faintest echo of something. Freedom, maybe. Or the beginning of justice. They thought I'd surrendered. They thought the signature meant the end, but the truth was already under their tree, wrapped in silver, waiting for dawn. From Lauren with truth. The morning after Christmas was too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm breaks open. Snow blanketed every roof and branch in Maple Falls, a flawless white that almost looked peaceful if you didn't know what was hiding underneath. I was already awake when I heard the faint clatter of dishes downstairs. The smell of coffee drifted through the hallway. I stood by my window looking out at the endless white, the whole town still wrapped in its holiday calm. Somewhere below, the truth I'd left under the tree was about to wake up. In the kitchen, my mother moved like she always did, graceful, controlled, rehearsed. She poured steaming coffee into 3 matching mugs, humming a Christmas tune under her breath. Across the counter, Jenna sat scrolling through her phone, her hair perfect as ever, her smile fading and reappearing as she read something on the screen. My father sat at the head of the table, half hidden behind the morning paper. Everything looked so normal that it almost made me laugh. Then the phone rang. My father frowned, folded his newspaper, and reached for the receiver. Charles Pierce speaking. The voice on the other end was male sharp and professional. I couldn't hear all the words, but I caught a few. Bank account. Irregular transactions. Temporary hold. My father's expression froze. Excuse me. His voice dropped. No, that can't be right. There must be a mistake. A pause. His face went pale. You're freezing all accounts. For what reason? Another pause. Then fine, I'll be there immediately. He hung up the phone with a dull thud. My mother looked up from her cup. Charles. What happened? Just an accounting issue, he said quickly, but his voice cracked halfway through the word. Accounting. Jenna frowned. Is everything okay? It's nothing, he snapped. I'll handle it. He grabbed his coat, muttering something about driving to the bank, but before he could reach the door, the low rumble of engines came from outside. My mother glanced out the window. Who's that? 2 black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of the house. The doors opened and 4 people stepped out, all wearing dark coats, with badges glinting under the winter sun. My father froze mid-step. Oh my God, my mother whispered. The woman leading them was tall, with sharp eyes, and a tone that left no room for argument. Mr. Charles Pierce, she called out. Detective Clara Holmes, Colorado State Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant to search the premises. Jenna let out a startled laugh as if it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. What? There must be. There's no way. My mother rushed forward. Detective, I think you have the wrong address. Holmes shook her head, already pulling papers from a folder. This is regarding Pierce Home and Tools, its affiliated entities, and several unreported financial transfers linked to JP Consulting LLC. My father's voice rose defensive. This is absurd. That's my daughter's company. You're mistaken. Then perhaps you can explain, Clara said evenly, why these transactions were notarized under your name, Mr. Pierce, and backdated to avoid tax audits. He blinked rapidly, color draining from his face. I don't know what you're talking about. Before anyone could answer, another voice cut through the tension, low and unmistakably calm. Oh, I think you do. Everyone turned. Owen Whitman stepped into the doorway, snow melting off his coat. He carried a stack of files under one arm, his presence filling the room like gravity. What the hell is this? My father hissed. Owen set the files down on the table, the sound loud in the silence. Evidence. Everything your bank and investors will want to see. Transfers, shell accounts, falsified statements. All of it. Jenna's eyes darted between them, panic rising. Dad, what's he talking about? My father's jaw clenched. You have no right to be here, Whitman. Owen didn't flinch. I have every right. You stole from me, and a lot of other people. The only difference now is that I'm not the only one who knows. Clara Holmes stepped closer, flipping through her documents. According to our reports, several of these transactions were notarized by your wife, Mrs. Evelyn Pierce, and funneled through your younger daughter's company. Is that correct? Evelyn gasped. That's impossible. I only signed what Charles told me to. Jenna's voice broke. Dad, tell them it's not true. But my father's silence said everything. His hands trembled as he rubbed at his temple, his breath shallow. You don't understand, he muttered. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to balance things out until the next quarter. Holmes' expression hardened. Forgery, money laundering, and wire fraud aren't temporary, Pierce, I did it for the family, he said hoarsely. Everything I did was for them. A brittle laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. The sound made everyone turn. I was standing in the hallway, coat still on, watching them. The sunlight from the open door caught the edge of the floor, cutting a bright line between me and them. My mother gasped softly. Lauren. I stepped closer, calm, steady. Good morning. My father looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. What did you do? I met his gaze without blinking. Nothing you didn't already set in motion. He took a step forward. You turned us in. I didn't have to. The truth has a way of showing up when you leave the lights on. Evelyn's voice shook. Lauren, please. You don't understand what this means. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said quietly. You built an empire on lies and thought no one would notice. Now the bills arrived. Clara looked between us, then flipped open her folder again. For the record, the primary victim listed in the fraudulent signatures is... She stopped and read aloud. Lauren Pierce. The silence that followed was deafening. My father turned to me, eyes wide, full of something between fury and fear. You planned this. I met his stare, my voice steady. No, you did. Owen crossed his arms, watching my father crumble beneath the weight of his own choices. You could have stopped this years ago, he said. But you thought you were untouchable. My father's breath hitched. He sank into the chair beside the table, his hands shaking. My mother dropped onto the couch, whispering the same sentence over and over. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. Jenna stood, frozen mascara running down her face. Dad, she choked, say something, but there was nothing left to say. The storm had arrived. I stood in the doorway, the light from outside spilling around me. Snow drifted through the open door, melting as it hit the floor. I hadn't destroyed them. I'd simply opened the blinds. And for the first time they were forced to see themselves clearly. By morning, Maple Falls didn't look like the same town. The calm, quiet streets I'd grown up with were buzzing with reporters, camera vans, and clusters of neighbors pretending they just happened to be passing by. The first headline hit before sunrise, Pierce family. Under investigation for million-dollar fraud. By mid-morning it was everywhere, on television, radio, every local feed. The Pierce name had been painted across this town for decades, on toolboxes, billboards, donation plaques in schools and churches. But that morning it was painted in something far less flattering scandal. Outside the Pierce Home and Tools headquarters, yellow caution tape lined the doors. Employees huddled in small circles clutching coffee cups, whispering, filming on their phones. Someone took a selfie with the taped doors behind them, adding the caption, "Maple Falls royalty finally dethroned." It had already been shared over 3,000 times before noon. A local reporter, Nora Kemp from Maple Today, stood by her van microphone in hand. I recognized her voice from years ago. She used to host the charity drives my parents sponsored. Now her tone was sharper. The Pierces, once seen as the heart of Maple Falls' small business community, are facing allegations of financial misconduct involving multiple shell companies and forged documents. Residents are left wondering, how long has this been going on? The camera panned to a woman holding grocery bags bundled in a scarf. They used to donate tools to the high school, she said. We thought they were good people. Guess money changes everyone. At the mayor's office, Bill Harrington, the same man who'd toasted my father at last year's holiday gala, stood pacing in his corner office, voice tight as he spoke to his assistant. If this thing spreads statewide, we lose our development grant. Tell communications to stay neutral. I don't want my name anywhere near that mess. Meanwhile, Jenna's face was splashed all over social media. Photos of her smiling at charity events, her entrepreneur posts on Instagram. Every caption suddenly turned against her. Comments flooded in fake heiress. Karma strikes again. Guess she learned accounting from her dad. Her following dropped by half overnight. My mother didn't fare much better. Evelyn Pierce, the woman who used to throw luncheons for Maple Falls elite, was now the subject of pitying whispers in grocery aisles. Her friends stopped answering calls. Even Karen Dalton, our friendly neighbor who once called my mother her holiday twin, crossed to the opposite side of the street when she saw her car pull into the parking lot. Inside the local market, 2 women whispered near the cereal aisle as Evelyn walked past. Poor thing, one said softly. Still you reap what you sow. Evelyn kept her chin high, but her trembling hands gave her away when she reached for a carton of milk. The perfect family image was dissolving fast. And 2 hours away, I sat in my Denver apartment watching it unfold on television. The afternoon sun spilled through my blinds, striping the hardwood floor. The news anchors' voices blended with the soft hum of traffic outside. I didn't move for a long time. Just watched the footage of flashing lights outside my family's house. The crowd gathered at the edge of our driveway, microphones extended like weapons. They showed my father escorted out of the office by investigators. His coat was wrinkled, his face pale, his once commanding posture bent under the weight of humiliation. They showed Jenna ducking into a car, face hidden behind dark sunglasses, tears glinting as cameras flashed. They showed my mother's front porch where she stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed tight, pretending none of this mattered. But it did. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. One vibration, then another, then another. Within minutes, it was constant. An unending flood of notifications, calls, messages. I picked it up once. 87 missed calls. Then 90. Then 99. Names filled the screen. Mom. Dad. Jenna numbers I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped. Then flipped it over so the light wouldn't show. The TV kept playing. Reporters dissecting every piece of the story. Analysts talking about fraud charges and plea deals, how the family could lose everything. My reflection flickered faintly on the dark surface of the screen when the broadcast cut to a commercial. My face looked calm. Too calm. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't triumph. It was relief. The kind that feels like oxygen after you've been holding your breath for years. I thought about the silver-wrapped box under the Christmas tree, the note that said, "From Lauren with truth." I didn't destroy them. I didn't need to. All I did was let the truth breathe. And once it did what truth always does. It burned through everything false. I stood and walked to the window. Denver stretching wide below me, the mountains hazy in the distance. The city moved on, indifferent to one family's downfall. Inside my apartment, the world was still. My coffee had gone cold. The phone buzzed one more time, vibrating faintly against the wood before falling silent. I reached down, turned it over, saw the 99th missed call from Mom. Then I pressed the side button and powered it off. The screen went black, taking their voices with it. I sat back on the couch, letting the silence settle. The kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. Karma never needs my hand. It only needs time and the truth. Outside, the wind shifted, pushing sunlight through the window. For the first time in years, it felt warm. I smiled, small and real. It wasn't victory. It was peace. A week later, the snow in Maple Falls had turned gray at the edges, packed hard from tires and boots, and too many bad headlines. The chaos had settled into something quieter. Grim acceptance, maybe. The Pierce name no longer hung from the storefront. The sign had been taken down, replaced with a sheet of plywood and a property of the state of Colorado sticker. I parked across the street from the police department, sitting for a moment before stepping out. The air was crisp, heavy, with that strange kind of silence that only comes after people have finished gossiping but haven't yet started forgiving. Inside, the station smelled faintly of old coffee and wet coats. Detective Clara Holmes greeted me with a nod from behind her desk. Her face was calm but tired, as if she'd spent the last week cleaning up the wreckage of other people's lies. "Miss Pierce," she said, motioning to a chair. "Thank you for coming back. We just need a final signature for the witness statement. It confirms you didn't participate in or authorize the transactions your father initiated." I sat, took the pen, and signed. My name looked steadier this time, like it finally belonged to me again. When I slid the paper back across the desk, Clara studied me for a moment. "You did the right thing," she said. I smiled faintly. Funny how the right thing never feels good. "It will," she replied quietly. "Eventually." Outside, the afternoon light had dimmed. The snow clouds were building again, a soft gray curtain over the town. I pulled on my gloves and pushed open the glass door, ready to leave it all behind. Until I saw her. My mother stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in a heavy coat, her hair pinned neatly, despite the cold. Her eyes were red like she hadn't slept in days. When she saw me, she stepped forward too quickly, almost slipping on the icy curb. "Lauren," she called, her voice trembling. "Please, we need to talk." For a second, I considered walking away, but something in her face, maybe exhaustion, maybe regret, made me stop. I nodded once. "All right." We walked to a small cafe near the square, the kind of place where everyone could see you but pretended not to. Inside, it was warm, filled with the smell of espresso and baked bread. We found a table near the window. My mother took off her gloves slowly, her hands shaking. When the waitress came, she ordered 2 teas, but didn't touch hers when it arrived. "Your father," she started, her voice cracking. "He's lost everything, Lauren. The accounts, the house, the company. It's all gone. They're talking about foreclosure. He can't take it." I folded my hands around my cup, the steam fogging my vision for a moment. "He did that to himself, Mom." Her head jerked up. "You don't understand. He was under pressure. He was trying to fix things." I cut her off softly but firm. "He forged my name. That's not fixing things. That's destroying them." Tears welled in her eyes. I know he was wrong. But he's your father, Lauren. You can't just stand by and watch him fall apart." I looked at her, and for the first time I saw not the immaculate woman who ruled our home, but someone small, frightened, and tired of pretending everything was fine. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was cold. "Please, you're stronger than me. You always were. Don't let this family end like this." I pulled my hand back gently. "It already ended, Mom. You just didn't notice when it did." Her face crumpled. "I was trying to protect us," she whispered. "Protect him. Protect our name." I opened my purse, reached inside, and took out a small silver bracelet, the one she'd given me on my 16th birthday. The charm had worn smooth over the years. I set it on the table between us. "Then keep this," I said. "It belongs to the person who chose silence over truth." She stared at it, her shoulders trembling. "Lauren, please. You always told me to be the good daughter," I said quietly. "But being good isn't the same as being right." Her tears spilled over, falling onto her hands. "You think I don't regret it?" "I regret everything. Every time I told you to stay quiet. Every time I turned away from what I knew. But he's my husband. I couldn't lose him. And you lost me instead." The words hung there, soft but sharp enough to break the air between us. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the espresso machine and the faint chatter of other customers. Finally, I stood. My chair scraped lightly against the tile. "Goodbye, Mom." Her head jerked up. "You can't walk away from family." I stopped at the door, my back to her. Family walked away from me first. I stepped outside before she could answer. The snow had started again, falling thicker now, covering the streets. The parked cars, the footprints of everyone who had come before. The wind muffled the sounds of the town. The church bell, the traffic. Even my mother's faint cry as she pushed out of the cafe behind me. But I didn't turn around. I pulled my coat tighter and walked down Main Street, the flakes melting against my skin, cold and clean. The past was still behind me, heavy and waiting. But it no longer owned me. Some things break so quietly, you don't hear them until the silence afterward. And in that silence, I finally understood justice wasn't loud. It was just honest. The courthouse in Denver was carved out of cold marble and long echoes. By the time I arrived, the steps outside were already crowded. Reporters, cameras, microphones, all aimed toward the double doors where the Pierce name had suddenly become a public fascination. Their breath turned to mist in the winter air, a storm of questions and flashing lights. I walked past them quietly, my heels clicking against the stone. A few shouted my name. I didn't answer. The truth didn't need another interview. Inside the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. The wood benches creaked beneath the weight of spectators and journalists scribbling notes. I found a seat in the first row behind the prosecution's table. My hands were steady, folded around the small notebook I carried, half journal, half record of everything my family had built and lost. When the bailiff called for order, the doors opened and my father entered between two officers. Charles Pierce looked smaller than I remembered. The crisp suits and practiced confidence were gone. His face was gaunt gray at the edges, his once thick hair flattened against his scalp. The sight of him made my stomach twist, not from pity exactly, but from something heavier, recognition of what power does when it's left unchecked too long. He avoided my eyes as they guided him to his seat. Across the room, Henry Ward, the notary who'd helped him forge the signatures, sat slumped forward, his hands trembling as he whispered to his lawyer. The judge entered, a tall man with glasses, and the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command silence. He read through the charges: fraud, falsified documents, coercion of witnesses, corporate misconduct. Each word fell like a nail closing a coffin. When Henry was called to testify, his voice shook. "Mr. Pierce told me it was urgent," he said, eyes darting toward my father. "He said it was just family paperwork. I knew it wasn't right, but he said I'd lose my job if I didn't help." The prosecutor's tone was cold, but even. "So you admit to falsifying signatures under pressure?" "Yes, ma'am," Henry whispered. "I'm sorry." The courtroom murmured. My father's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table edge. Then the judge looked toward me. "Miss Pierce," he said, "would you like to make a statement before we adjourn?" For a moment the sound in the room faded. The shuffling papers, the tapping pens, even the distant hum of cameras outside. I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my coat, and faced the bench. "I came here today. I said, my voice clear, not to seek revenge, but to confirm the truth. What happened to my family wasn't an accident. It was a choice. My father built his reputation on hard work, but somewhere along the way he started believing the rules didn't apply to him. And when the truth became inconvenient, he tried to erase it. Erase me." The words hung in the air. I didn't look at him until the very end. When I did, I kyunk something flicker behind his eyes, a fragile, fractured mix of pride and regret. The look of a man who finally understood the cost of what he'd done. The judge nodded once. "Thank you, Miss Pierce. Your statement is entered into record." He turned back to the court. "Given the evidence presented, the state of Colorado finds sufficient cause to move this case to trial. Formal proceedings will begin 3 weeks from today." A wave of movement swept through the room. Reporters scribbling faster, whispers rippling through the benches. My father bowed his head, the sound of the gavel echoing once before the bailiff called for recess. Outside, the air felt sharper, almost metallic. Cameras swiveled as the courthouse doors opened, but Owen Whitman was already waiting at the bottom of the steps. He didn't say anything at first, just handed me a cup of hot coffee from the cafe across the street. Steam curled up between us, faint against the pale sunlight. Justice isn't loud, he said finally. It's steady. I smiled faintly, the words settling somewhere deep. And it comes right on time. We stood there for a moment, watching the reporters crowd around the courthouse steps, each of them desperate for a quote that could make sense of what had just happened. But justice doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to exist. Then I saw her. Jenna. She was standing a few feet away, clutching her coat around her shoulders. Her hair hung loose, her face pale and streaked from crying. When she saw me, she hesitated, then walked closer, her boots crunching softly against the snow. Lauren, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry. I nodded slowly. For what? Her lip trembled. For everything. For not stopping him. For pretending I didn't see what he was doing. I just wanted to be loved. The words hit like a sigh that had been waiting years to escape. You don't have to earn love, Jenna, I said gently. Real love doesn't need to be stolen or traded. She looked up, tears shining in her eyes. Do you hate me? I shook my head. No. I just finally stopped hurting for you. Before she could reply, one of the officers called her name. She turned away, shoulders shaking as they led her toward a waiting car. I watched until the door closed, and the car pulled out of sight. The square outside the courthouse was still covered in snow, the sun trying its best to push through the clouds. It wasn't bright, not really, but it was there cutting through just enough to cast light on the courthouse steps. I tilted my head back and let it touch my face. The cold air filled my lungs sharp and clean. For years I'd been waiting for the sky to clear. And now, for the first time it had, by the time winter loosened its grip on Colorado, the city had already begun to bloom again. The snow along the curbs melted into small rivers that ran down the streets, glinting beneath the morning sun. Denver in spring smelled like rain and beginnings, clean, new, forgiving. I unlocked the glass door to my new office just after 8. The sign above it still looked too new, the black lettering crisp against white Pierce and Whitman Studio. Every time I saw it, a strange calm filled me, a reminder that endings could make space for something better. Inside, sunlight spilled through the wide windows, catching on sheets of drafting paper and rolls of blueprints stacked neatly by the wall. The air still carried the faint scent of paint and wood polish. It didn't smell like my father's company ever had. It smelled like possibility. I set my bag down and took a moment to stand in the middle of the room, letting the silence settle around me. A knock on the door broke it. Jason Miller stepped inside, a bunch of yellow tulips in his hands. He looked the same, rumpled, kind-eyed, a little out of breath from climbing the stairs. Well, he said, holding the flowers up, I didn't think I'd see the Pierce name above another door so soon. I smiled. Technically, it's half Whitman. Still looks good, he said, setting the flowers on my desk. Congratulations. The liquidation's wrapping up this week. Once it's finalized, you'll officially receive your portion of the assets. The rest will go toward restitution. I repeated softly. Testing the word. That's a nice way of saying consequences. He gave a small shrug. Justice doesn't always feel clean, but it does feel done. And it's done. Lauren, I nodded. Meaning it this time. Thank you for everything. You didn't have to stand by me. Maybe not. He said, but some people deserve to start over. And you did the work. After he left, I walked around the office, running my hand along the edge of the new conference table Owen had helped design. It was solid oak, simple and strong, nothing like the glossy veneer my father used to insist on. There was something grounding about its weight, its honesty. On my desk, I placed the last item from my old apartment, a small worn photo frame. Inside was the only picture that had ever captured all 4 of us together. I was maybe 12 in it. Jenna 8. My father had one arm around my mother's shoulder, his other hand holding the camera remote. The corner was torn, the colors faded, but I didn't replace it. I didn't keep it because I missed them. I kept it to remember how far I'd come from the girl in that picture. The morning light caught the frame's glass, splitting it into fragments across the desk. I stared at it for a long moment, then turned toward the window. The city stretched beyond the glass, mountains still capped with snow in the distance, rooftops glinting under the bright sky. I opened the window slightly, letting the breeze in. My computer chimed a new email sliding into the inbox. The subject line read, Feature Pitch, Women Who Rewrote Their Own Stories, from Nora Kemp. Maple today. A small smile tugged at my lips. I opened it. Lauren, it began. I'm writing a series about women who faced public collapse and rebuilt their lives on their own terms. I'd love to include you if you're willing to share your journey. Not as a victim, but as a survivor. Let me know if you'd consider it." For a moment, I just stared at the words, the weight of what they meant. Not scandal, not pity, just recognition. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sun warm my face. Maybe I thought this was how healing really looked. Not loud, not cinematic, just steady. I walked over to the kitchenette, poured water into the coffee maker, and pressed the button. The smell of fresh brew filled the air, blending with the faint scent of tulips. Music drifted softly from the small speaker on the shelf. Jazz, something light enough to feel like motion. Then the phone rang. I didn't move at first. The screen lit up on the desk, the name glowing in sharp white Mom. The sound filled the room, rhythmic, almost pleading. I stood there, one hand around my mug, the other hovering over the phone. 5 rings, 6, 7. I let it go to voicemail. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. I set the mug down, turned back toward the window, and watched a few stray petals from the tulips catch the light breeze. Sometimes closure isn't a conversation. Sometimes it's the choice not to pick up. I stepped out onto the small balcony. The city air was cool but soft, carrying the scent of wet pavement and early blossoms. The mountains shimmered faintly under the sun, a reminder that winter always ends, no matter how long it lasts. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs until it almost hurt. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt whole, quietly, simply completely. Spring came early that year, soft and warm, carrying the scent of cherry blossoms down the highway toward Maple Falls. I hadn't been back since the trial. Hadn't seen the streets, the house, or the mountain horizon I once thought I'd never leave. But the road knew me. Every curve, every turn, every stretch of pine trees whispered pieces of a past I no longer feared. The town looked smaller now, quieter. The banners that used to hang outside the old Pierce Home and Tools warehouse were gone, the windows sealed with state-issued stickers. The sign that once bore my family's name now read, "For sale." A gust of wind rattled the loose hinges of the front door. I parked across the street and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. Through the window, I could see the shelves stripped bare, the walls hollow and echoing. My father's desk was still there, a faint ring where his coffee mug used to sit. For years, I'd imagined this place as the center of everything solid and certain in my life. Now it was just space, empty, still honest. I didn't stay long. Some things don't need goodbyes. The church sat at this edge of town, just past the old maple grove. Its white steeple peeked through branches heavy with blossoms. When I pushed the door open, the familiar scent of candle wax and wood polish surrounded me, pulling me back to a simpler version of myself. The little girl who used to sit in the second pew, with her feet barely touching the floor. Inside sunlight filtered through the stained glass painting the aisle in soft colors. At the altar, Pastor Raymond Cole was arranging hymn books. When he turned and saw me, his face broke into a kind, knowing smile. "Well," he said softly, "if it isn't Lauren Pierce. It's been a while." I smiled back. "It has." He gestured toward a pew. "You here looking for something?" I sat down. My hands resting in my lap. "Maybe peace," I said quietly. He nodded, taking a seat beside me. "People come here for that more than anything else, but peace doesn't always mean forgetting." "I don't want to forget," I said. "I just don't want it to hurt anymore." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Forgiveness isn't about them, Lauren. It's about freeing yourself from carrying what they did." I let his words settle the stillness of the church wrapping around them. I think I said after a moment, "I've finally done that." He smiled gently. "Then you've already found what you came for." I thanked him and stood. Before I left, he said, "You know your father came here once, years ago after your graduation. He told me he didn't know how to keep up with the person you were becoming." The words landed softly, not as an ache, but as closure. "Then I guess we're both free now," I said, and stepped outside. The air was warm, the petals from the cherry trees drifting across the churchyard like slow snow. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Owen Whitman, the screen read. I answered with a smile already forming. "Lauren." He said, his voice steady as ever. "I thought you'd want to know first. The court approved the transfer. Pierce Home and Tools will be restructured under a new name. Pierce and Whitman Foundation." I stopped mid-step. "Foundation." "That's right," he said. We'll use the profits from the sale to fund business grants for women entrepreneurs across Colorado. You'll be the co-director. I'll send the paperwork tonight. I felt the sting of tears before I could stop them. You're serious? As serious as justice, he said with a small laugh. It's the least we can do with what's left. I swallowed hard, staring at the empty building across the street. That's the most beautiful thing we could have made out of all this. It's your story. Lauren, he said softly, you chose how it ends. When the call ended, I stood there for a long while, letting the words sink in. The town was quiet again. The wind swept through the cherry trees, scattering petals that shimmered like tiny pieces of light. That Christmas they thought I'd come home to bring chaos. But the truth was simpler. The gift I brought wasn't revenge. It was justice wrapped in silence, tied with time. I got into my car, started the engine, and looked once more toward the church steeple before driving away. Halfway down the highway, my phone buzzed again. 99 missed calls, all from Mom. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering for a moment. Then I pressed the side button and turned the sound off. The world outside the windshield was bathed in sunlight, the air full of motion and promise. I rolled the window down, the wind catching my hair, carrying away everything that used to weigh me down. The mountains gleamed faintly in the distance, blue and endless. For the first time, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt alive. And if you've ever been erased from your own story, remember, you can always write a new one.